Hello, and thanks for checking out the video. Today I'm in the garden, and that's really in response to some of the wonderful comments. Well, all of the comments are wonderful, and thank you very much. You know, I'd like to thank people for sending in the comments. Some of the questions I get are obviously about equipment and gear, and people have suggested perhaps doing a video to explain some of the bits and pieces. And the bits and pieces of gear I carry are so minimal anyway. I'd really just thought today I might concentrate on the shelter side of things, which is one of the main bits, obviously. So one of the easiest ways to stick to natural materials when it comes to the shelter is to use these sort of Soviet era or Warsaw Pact era cotton canvas military capes or cloaks or ponchos, you know, whatever you want to call them. And they're basically all based on a 6 foot square of canvas, and with plenty of eyelets and loads of buttons. I've paid on average, you know, I've had 3 or 4 now, and they come in at around £30 a piece. And you know, they're pretty versatile and pretty tough. Well, they're supposedly 6 foot square. They're actually a little bit less than 5'11". You know, they're under 180 centimeters square. But I'm only 5'6" in height. These particular ones, and these are my favourite ones, these East German Zeltbahn. You know, they call them the NVA military cape, I think, Nationale Volksarmee. Great canvas, great bit of kit, but yeah, obviously there is a bit of polyprop line in there, a bit of a palaver to get it out, so I'll leave it in, you know. It's always a compromise. Now this one behind me is a Romanian Plash Palatka. They might have their own name for it in that country anyway. Again, it's the same square, same size square of cotton canvas. And as you notice, again, all the buttons, and the buttons are for joining these things together. You know, today I'm just talking about using a single cloak. But ideally, in the situations that they were probably designed to be used, you'd connect up with a buddy who'd have another one, and you'd connect 2 together and make a larger shelter. Sometimes you could connect multiple amounts together and make even bigger shelters. You know, really versatile bit of kit. You know, lots of countries have them, or had them anyway. You know, Norway had a version, Belgium, all over the place. Sometimes they're not necessarily a square of canvas. Behind me I've got the very famous Polish lavu. Again, I'm concentrated, that's just half, that's just one single cape there. That's all I carry out, one cape for my shelter, so that's what I'm concentrating on today. And that's a very popular, very, you know, everyone's heard of the Polish lavu pretty much. It's the Polish army version of the same thing, but it's a more sophisticated shelter. With 2 of them you can make a great teepee. Whereas this Zeltbahn or Plash Palatka are more simplistic, so you have to perhaps have a little more imagination as to how you're going to make your shelter. Interestingly enough, when it comes to pack weight, pack size and weight really, which is so vital, you know, I think when you're using natural fibres, because you're competing against modern synthetics which will beat you hands down. So you know, we've got to talk about minimum kit and the weight of the kit. Now this particular one here, I have actually waxed it, so it adds, you know, say 30 or 50 grams more to it, but it comes in at over 1700 grams, whereas the NVA, the Zeltbahn version here, this comes in at just over 1200 grams. So it's a much more, same size, but a more lightweight one. Another reason why I like this particular one, the NVA one. But today we're just going to talk about using one single cape and how it could be set up as a reasonably good shelter, and the same thing will apply to anyone who's got a square tarp, you know. So here's a basic lean-to shelter using the full length of the tarp for the lean-to. Gives you loads of space. You've got to carry in a ground sheet though, obviously, and I'm going to compare size-wise. I'm 5'6", so you can see things are pretty tight with regards to weather protection at either end. And I'll go and lay in the lavu and compare it. Yeah, I think there's better weather protection with this, definitely. You know, the canvas at each end goes right down. I've got some, like a vestibule area here. You know, this is one cape, this is really half a teepee, half a lavu. But This is the smallest size lavoo, by the way. This is a size 1, but I'm 5'6". Size 1 does me fine. Yeah, I just want to say that you know, these methods are only my ideas. You know, they're not necessarily the best by any means. And there's guys and girls out there, and you only need to look on YouTube, doing far better methods and systems than I use. It's just throwing my idea in the mix because a few people in the comments, you know, were interested. You know, and I certainly don't want to teach people to suck eggs. You know, I'm well aware that people out there are far more au fait with all of this kind of thing. Just a quick word on knots, if I may. You know, knots can really turn people off and worry people, and you know, people might think, oh, if I'm going to go camping with simple gear like a tarp, I'm going to have a plethora of knots to choose from. And that's not the case. You know, it's nice, knots are great, and it's nice to have all the right knots, but I don't want people to be worried about or put off by, you know, getting out in the woods by thinking they need knots. You know, you don't need knots. Today I'm going to try and get everything done, everything done with just 2 knots, and one of the knots really isn't a knot to teach anyone, because it's an instinctive knot that every human being knows, really, you know, and everyone's tied. You know, however much you hate knots, you will have tied what's commonly known as the overhand knot, or sometimes known as the thumb knot, where you just pass one piece of line over the other, and there you have it. You know, so you think, well, what good is that? Well, you know, that overhand knot can be applied in different ways. For example, you don't necessarily need to tie it in a single bit of cord. You can tie it in a loop of cord, you know, so you're tying the exact same thing, but you're doing it with a double amount of cord. What good is that? Well, look, it's given, for example, it's given you a little loop there, a little strong loop. You know, that's just showing what the overhand knot can do. As I say, I'm not really there's only 2 knots we're going to use to get all the bits done today, and I don't even think that this is really only 1, because I don't really think this is a knot that anyone needs to learn. You just cross the line over, and there you have it, the overhand knot. You know, let's say we did it before using double the amount of line. Let's do it with these 2 lines. Same thing, cross it over. And what does that got you? Well, that's got you a way of joining, very simply, joining 2 lines together. And that's a very strong way of joining 2 lines together. When it goes under load, it might jam up, and you might struggle to get it undone, but 9 times out of 10 when you use a knot like the thumb knot, it tends to be permanent or a semi-permanent arrangement. You know, you might be tying up prusik loops, and if you're joining 2 cords together like this, chances are something's gone wrong, so you know, at the end of the day, you might not mind cutting that knot out if you can't untie it. These 2 staffs are representing 2 trees. I set them up this morning. It's just a bit of heavy pruning I did 5 months ago or so. And obviously the trees that you'd use would be a lot thicker, most certainly in the forest. You know, you wouldn't perhaps necessarily rely on something that's as thin as this to put some tension on. The other thing is you'd consider your ground conditions and what's above your head in regards to safety. You know, people talk about widowmakers, but I'm not going to talk about any of that kind of thing. We're just going to concentrate on the setting up of the shelter itself. 9 times out of 10 when people are setting up a tarp, or in our case a poncho or a military cape, they use one main line, which is called the ridge line. It's a line that's run taut, usually between 2 fixed points. My ridge line's a little bit less than 8 meters long, and it seems to deal with all eventualities, really. It's made of jute, which is you know, quite a cheap but quite a strong natural fibre cordage, and at the time it was easily available on the internet. It's the same stuff, I think, that hessian is made out of, or what they call in America burlap, I think, that kind of material. But anyway, it's pretty good, pretty strong, but it does shrink in length slightly, and it does swell up when it's wet, so it's got, you know, all the disadvantages of a natural fibre line. Like most people, I've got a fixed loop in the end of my line. This is an eye splice I did. It's handy to have a fixed loop in the end of your ridge line. It's just to do with quick deployment and a quick and easy way of fixing it to your first anchor point. It doesn't have to be a spliced eye like this. That's just a neat permanent way of making a a loop in the end of the line. For example, you could, you know, if you wanted to, or if you just happened to be grab a bit of line that you needed as your ridge line, you could just rely on the old thumb knot that we were talking about earlier, and just double your line over at the end and then tie a thumb knot. That will give you a nice fixed loop like that. Same thing, nice fixed loop. Well, why do we want a fixed loop? Well, it's quite a good way of setting up quickly and getting a good first anchor point, because you just pass, obviously this is going to be a lot thicker in the woods. This is only a small piece of timber that I found. Pass it around the tree and then pass the standing part through that fixed loop. And then you grab a stick off the forest floor, we call it a toggle, but it's just a small stick, and pass it through, and you've got a nice solid fixing. Yeah, really easy to do. So you pass the end with the fixed loop around the tree, take the standing part of the line, put it through that fixed loop, put your toggle in and pull it tight. And that's a quick, easy way of making your first fixing point. But more importantly, in the morning when this has been under tension all night, and it's rained all night and this is all swollen up and doesn't want to undo, that knot would get quite jammed up under those conditions. But this is almost like a quick release system, because you've only got to loosen it, pull out the toggle, take the tension off the line and pull out that toggle, and that will release. So we get to the other end, to our other fixed anchor point, and the first thing you've got to make sure is all your prusiks are in the standing part of the line between the two trees, or the two fixed points, because they'd be no good if you end up tying up your prusiks in the knotting up at this end. And then you want to create tension in the ridge line, quite a bit of tension, and the best way of holding that tension is just to take a turn around the tree like that. So once you've got that tension, it's a lot easier now to hold that, and whatever happens, you've got control of it. You're not likely to lose all that hard work. And then the simplest way, and in the ethos of minimal, simple old school gear, just take a few more turns underneath the standing part. You see, I turned the first turn underneath the standing part, and these turns are underneath the standing part, until you've got at least 6, 7, 8 turns like that around the tree, and then all the friction is taken up on the tree itself, and then just hang what's left of the tail end of the line over the standing part, and that's enough to hold it. That will hold now, so there's no knot involved there, nice and simple. And this is actually work, we used to call this the no knot. It's a very good rescue knot, because again it's one of those knots that can be released when there's tremendous tension here, and it can be released in an emergency situation. One man can release this knot, regardless of the tension that's actually being applied to the knot itself. Now, to tidy up so you haven't got loose strands of gear, you can loop up all your excess tail line like this, and then tie it in a thumb knot. Don't know if you can see that on the camera. So it just hangs down like that. Adds a bit more gravity to this here. If this is bouncing around in the wind, or you might be knocking it, or people might be bouncing, you might be knocking your tarp, and you fear it might just possibly it won't, but just possibly start to work loose, just take a few frapping turns around the standing part like that. That's belt and braces, then nothing's going to go anywhere. So you haven't done any knots there, but you've got quite a good and easily releasable friction system to hold that ridge line and keep the tension in it. So here's a prusik loop. This one, there's a couple of them permanently attached to the line. It's just handy for a quick deployment. So what's a prusik loop? How does it work? What's it for? What's it all about? Well, let's make one quickly. Take a short piece of cordage, tie your thumb knot or overhand knot, whatever you want to call it, quite close to the two ends of the cord, and then you're making a nice strong fixed loop, and that's where the loop part of the prusik is the knot, and these are prusik loops because they're made out of these permanent loops. So the next thing is, all you need to do is pass your loop over and through on itself 2 times. So that's once, that's twice. Dress the knot, and that's your prusik loop. Really that simple. Really that simple. Take your permanent loop. I always keep the knotted end down and out of the way and make this the working end, which hasn't got a knot to get in the way. So you pass it through on itself once, and then through on itself again. Dress the knot, and that's your prusik loop. Now the great thing about a prusik knot is it's basically a friction hitch. It's an old-fashioned one, and lots of people will argue that it's no good anymore, but it's brilliant for things like setting up shelters, because it's a friction hitch that can be slid along the line very easily when there's no tension on it. But as soon as there's tension on it, it grabs the line, and it can take pulls from the left and pulls from the right, or pulls from the right and pulls from the left, and it'll grip every time. And yet it still, when you want it to, can be slid and put into the right position for your shelter. The disadvantages of the prusik, it sometimes jams up, and in particular in this natural fibre cord, you know, if it's under tension all night and it's swelling up due to dew or just rain, those loops can jam up. That is a big disadvantage, and then it requires taking the pressure off the knot and working it a bit. Sometimes you have to work it a bit, and then once it's looser, then you can start manoeuvring it along the main ridge line. If you can tie the prusik knot, you can also tie the cow hitch, because the cow hitch, there's a prusik, look. Dress it nice and neat so it looks nice. The cow hitch is just one stage of the prusik. It's just passed through the first time. It won't grip length along the cord like a prusik will, but a cow hitch is a very quick way of fixing a loop of line to an object through a buttonhole, or you know, even around a stick. So I didn't, you know, we don't need to include the cow hitch as another knot because it's just the first stage of the prusik knot. But yeah, cow hitch, a handy little way of attaching a loop of line to any object really, especially through buttonholes, which we'll see a bit later on. Position the prusiks where you want the shelter to be. Then just pass the loop of the prusik through the eyelet of the one corner of the shelter, and a toggle through that to hold it. Same at the other end. These NVA Zeltbahns have a little sewn in loop there which can be utilised, so you can attach the cape actually halfway along as well with just a little stick like that. They don't all have those. Find the midpoint of one side of the cape, and then a little bit further along, pick one of the buttonholes. It's rather hard to get a peg that you've made in the woods through any of these buttonholes, so if you are making pegs for your tarp or your cape, which I tend to do rather than carry them out, is just have some fixed loops, and you're just going to use the cow hitch. Pass that through the buttonhole, pass it through on itself once, and that's a cow hitch. That will tie into the buttonhole, and then if you've got thicker pegs made out of sticks, it's not a problem to peg it out like that. By setting the ridge line lower, about waist height in my case, we've made a smaller lean-to, but we've been able to utilise some of the military cape as actually the ground sheet as well. So we haven't got to carry out a ground sheet in this particular case. And I find that it's quite a good little setup because it does trap the heat of the fire quite well, this smaller lean-to. With most of these setups, it's always worth considering utilising the armhole of the cape as a means of pulling out to make more space within the shelter. It stops some of the sagging of these old cotton canvas sheets. And the way to do that is quite easily by just tucking a toggle into the armhole and then pegging it out. So how do we do that? Well, a nice reliable way is I carry around a permanent toggle line for this kind of thing. You don't have to, you could knock it up in the woods. Again, just rely on the thumb knot. Do another thumb knot, but just do this thumb knot over the line. Let's get a better bit of line. It's a better bit of line so you might be able to see it. We're just going to tie another thumb knot. This thumb knot is over the line itself, so take it over the line and then just do a thumb knot. And then we have what's basically a noose. So once again, all we're doing is a thumb knot, but we're just utilising it over the top of the standing part of the line. So take it over or under, in this case under the standing part of the line, tie the overhand knot, and you've made yourself a kind of running noose. And that, with your toggle, is a good means of fixing your toggle. So just put a bit of tension on that. Put your peg in. Then do exactly as we did with the ridge line. You know, the taut line hitch would be an ideal adjustable knot for this, but we can just do the no knot instead, so we're not involving any knots. Just lots of turns underneath the standing part, and then lay the line over the standing part, and maybe in this case do a few frapping turns as well. And then if you need to adjust it during the night, or the shelter has become misshapen for various reasons, the wind is buffeting it or whatever, it's just a simple job of readjusting it, readjusting the tension, and once again making a no knot, taking 6 or more turns underneath the standing part, the line, and then laying it over the line. And in this case it's likely to get knocked or buffeted. I'd take a few frapping turns over the standing part as well. Just a little something here I wanted to mention. Let's say you know, you've lost some of the tension in this line. I don't know, for whatever reason, the shelter's been buffeted about, or it's been readjusted so many times. It's, you know, the prusiks are pulling here, there, and everywhere, and you just feel, oh, I'd really like my ridge line to be retightened. But there's an awful lot of gear hanging on it now. You've got your tarp hanging on it. You've got all the pegging out, possibly your pot hanger off it. Who knows? Bit of clothing. You know, you've got everything set up. You don't want to have to tear it all down to reset your ridge line. Well, you don't really have to. You can tweak a little bit of extra tension onto the ridge line without taking all the shelter and all the gear apart. Take off these frapping turns like this. Now remember to keep a bit of strain on that. On your hand. You don't want to completely loosen it off. You don't want to lose more tension than you've lost already, you know. Take a few of the turns off. Then what you can do is you can start wrapping this running end around the standing part and just cinching it up a little bit. You know, take a turn over the top of it like that, go over the top of your standing part and cinch it up. And that will just produce a bit more tension on that. And you can do the same thing again the other side if you want a bit more tension. Go over that side, cinch it up again, and keep adding a little bit more at a time. Over it again, cinch it up again, and each time you're adding a bit more tension to this ridge line. You know, and that's getting very tight now. You don't want to overdo it, but so let's say we're happy with that. Just finish off with no knot at all. No knot at all is just under the standing part. Make 6 or more turns. I don't know how many that is. That's probably 5, 6 or more. and then lay it over the standing part like that. And as I say, you might want to tie up this with a thumb knot just to make it neat and tidy, and perhaps do a few frapping turns over there just for belt and braces. So you've managed to tweak up your ridgeline without fiddling and taking apart any of your shelter and all your hard work. So when it comes to breaking camp, especially if you've had a wet night, this is likely to be swollen and it might well jam onto the ridgeline. You know, you might, okay, I can do it today, everything's bone dry today, but you might not be able to pull that in to loosen it, to release this toggle and start taking it all down. Let's say it's jammed up there. That's the time then you'll go back to the no knot, and you can, in a controlled way, release the strain off this ridge line. That'll slacken everything up, and then you'll find it a lot easier to work this prusik knot. Just work it a bit, loosen it up, and then it'll start to slide on the main ridge line again. And once it does, yeah, take out the toggle, start tearing it down. Now we'll have a go at the diamond shaped shelter, which is commonly called the plough point or the ploughshare type configuration. And so one point is down on the ground, with one end of the ridge line pegged with a quite heavy or quite a strong peg into the ground, because that's going to act as the spine which the shelter is going to hang over. You know, the cape is going to hang over this, and the other end will take up to the tree quite high up, and this is where we'll be putting on the tension of the line. The point of the shelter that goes nearest to the tree, this is going to be the high end of the shelter. I normally set back about approximately 1.5 meters from the tree itself. That gives it good room to gain height, but also importantly keeps you away from the root system. If you're going to have a fire, get the fire off the ground anyway. You know, that's the golden rule. Try and put it in a container, then you haven't got too many worries. But if it's anywhere close to the ground or any chance of contacting the ground, you know, you're very close to a tree, then you've got to check there might be roots there. This cord cinches up for the piece to go around the shoulders. This cord runs through here and cinches up for the hood. Make sure they're down at the low end. Make sure they're down at the pegged into the ground end. You'll find that means that the flaps for the armholes are in the correct position. You know, they're going to weather correctly. They're not facing up and are going to collect water coming in. So yeah, if you're using a Plash Palatka or Zeltbahn, remember that the hooded end of the corner where the hood is the end to go low. It's the end to be pegged into the ground. Make sure the prusik knot is way down on the standing part of the line, out of the way of the knot you're about to do, or the no knot. Six or more turns below the standing part. And then pass the running end over the top of the line, over the top of the ridge line. We just tidy this bit up here, do a few frapping turns around that, because this is all inclined to lean down towards the entrance of the shelter and where the fireplace is, so you might want to just tuck that out of the way as well. I usually try and give a worded answer I can, especially to questions, but I hope in the meantime that if anyone had any queries about the sort of shelter setups or anything like that, I hope this little video has perhaps gone some way towards answering a few of those questions anyway.